So first off, I want to say thank you to everybody that supported me throughout the years by buying this course. It made a huge difference in my life. It was really lovely that everybody was so nice to support me. The course has aged out a little bit. There's a couple of things in there that are a little bit older that might not be as relevant anymore today. But there's still a core of knowledge, I think, that's there that's still quite interesting. As such, I've decided to release it for free, both here on YouTube and on the platforms I was selling it on. So if you hadn't had a chance to look at it yet, this is your chance. If you get it on one of the other platforms, it'll be structured in different chapters with all these individual videos. But for the purposes of not spamming everybody's YouTube subscriptions, I basically edited all the chapters together for this. So I hope it's still useful to some of you. And yeah, I would say enjoy the course if you hadn't heard of it yet. And I'll see you around. Thanks again for all the support. Later. As you might have seen from some promotional material, the Blender UI I'll be using during this course is slightly different than the default. And really, it's down to a few personal preferences, but also a few practical considerations as well. I use a lot of modifiers, so I like to have a lot of space in my startup file to use modifiers and not be cramped by what's going on the screen. So with the very fresh sort of install of Blender, I'm using version 2.83. This is currently the beta, so this splash screen might look a little bit different for you, but it's down to the same idea. I want to kind of clean up this scene and kind of make it as minimalistic as possible. And we're going to do that in two parts. First, we're going to customize our startup files, and secondarily, we're going to look at the preferences. So let's start with that. First of all, I'm going to leave all of this default. I'm going to select with left and use play for the spacebar, and let's leave on the dark theme as well as using the Blender shortcuts. So I'm going to hit Save New Settings initially and just click away the splash screen. So by default, I have a couple of things that I like to do, such as, let's take away the timeline here. Let's grab all this stuff and make this a little bit larger. So I'm going to delete all of these extra workspaces because I know the shortcuts for the different panels of Blender. So I like switching between the panels and making my own panels here. And let's call this default. And now we know we've customized this. Now, I was very quick there, but I basically just dragged the corners of each. And if you drag these out, you'll create a new panel. But if you drag them in over on top of another panel, you'll actually drag these out. So let's do this, and let's do this twice. So the way I like setting things up over here is to have all of my properties here. And the reason for that is we're using a whole bunch of modifiers, and I'm just going to add, if we have a bevel and then maybe wireframe or whatever, you can see this starts filling up quite quickly. And I like to have the full sort of height of my screen to have enough information there so I can quickly switch between different modifiers and have a few of them open all at once. Now I'm going to do this something similar here where I've got my outliner. And in this case, if we're working with a lot of modifiers, so let's see if we throw on a subdivision surface here, for example. I'm not creating any art or anything, but I just want to show you in the outliner, if you hit the plus key on your numpad, you actually open up and show all these modifiers. And this is really nice to have these two columns to have a lot of vertical space to work either with a lot of objects or with a lot of modifiers. So again, yeah, let's just leave it at that for now and set up a couple of defaults that look good. So let's start with render settings with Eevee. Let's set up Eevee, and I'm going to leave these samples to the default, set up ambient occlusion, turn on bloom, turn on my screen space reflections, and we'll talk about optimizing these at a later date, and just have enough going on here. I like to move up the color management here as well, so I can easily switch between different looks, for example. So I like a slightly more contrasty look by default, so I can set that up. And that's pretty much it for now. I'm not going to worry about that too much. For example, you could set your default settings for saving. So generally, I'll set these to JPEG, especially when I'm doing animations. If I set this to 1 and maybe 300 rather, and a frame rate of 30. Now I've got 10 seconds and I set this to the default. This is, I'm using Linux, so this is the default sort of temporary directory. You could set up any directory you want. That way I know when I do test renders, they're going to be JPEGs and they're going to be fairly quick to save and I know exactly where they are. Again, this is all just down to personal preference. So It's up to you what you prefer. But yeah, I just like to set a few of these things up. Passes, I don't really enable any particular one by default. But what I will do is turn off gravity. If I do any simulations, they're not immediately affected by gravity. I need to turn it on myself, and we'll talk about that a little bit later in like the particle settings, particle and cloth simulation stuff when we get to it. And same with the units. In general, so let's open up our side panel here. Everything is set to meters. In general, what I'll do is just set the unit system to none, because I know these are meters anyway. I don't need the extra indication there. Unless I want to do something very specific with the units, I like to turn this off so that it's just values and I'm not really confusing myself with anything else or cluttering up the UI with anything else. And you'll see this as we're setting this up in the preferences, that it's all about just taking away extra stuff in your UI to kind of keep your workplace focused. And yeah, that's about it. I'll generally turn down the surface of the world. So if you just set this to rendered very quickly, if we set this to black, it basically means outside of the light, if I turn this off, we're not actually going to get any lighting in our scene. So anything that we add, we know we're starting from scratch and we're not getting any influence from anything in the background. And that's roughly it. Yeah, so I'm going to adjust these a little bit and just move on to the outliner from here. Now, by default, if I go back to solid mode here, what's going on in the outliner is that we only have the toggles for hiding in the viewport enabled, and I don't really use those an awful lot. So generally what I'll do is actually turn those off and turn on the toggles for being able to select stuff in the viewport and then seeing it in the viewport. This is a different viewport enabler. So this is just hiding it in the viewport, and this is altogether disabling it in the viewport. And especially if you're using a lot of modifiers, you might prefer to use disable rather than hide, because it's not actually going to take into account a lot of those modifiers. It's going to turn a lot of that computation off, which is nice. And then disable in renders as well. So with those set up, I've got a bit more control, and also I can turn on and off modifiers here in the expanded view if I want to. And that's kind of what I wanted to show you, what I was doing earlier. And yeah, it's good to know. Now we can easily turn on and off modifiers in our viewport if we want to, which is quite nice. We don't always have to go to the modifier panel and start clicking away. And you'll see, especially in some of the more advanced examples, we might have 5 or 6 or 7 or maybe even up to 10 modifiers. And it's real easy just to be able to click and drag these and turn them off. Another thing I'm going to do is just hit T in the viewport to hide that panel over there, and hit N in the viewport to hide that panel on the right. But before I actually do that, I want to change one more thing, and I want to actually change the focal length of my viewport. I like this just a little bit better. Back in the day in Blender 2.7, this was set to 35, which meant you had quite a bit of distortion. Now it's set to 50. I don't know why, it's just a personal thing. I like setting this to 70 millimeters as it gives you somewhere between an isometric and a perspective view, and I just get a better feel for the scene in general. Now again, this is all purely personal. You know, you don't have to do that if you don't want to. So I think that's about it. Everything else I do is just deleting everything that's in the starting scene, and maybe even delete this collection as well, just so I have a very clean starting point for my scene. And keep in mind as well that even your viewport rotation is going to be set. So our y-axis is actually going to point towards the back. So if we set this up now, we know the front of our scene is pointing this way and the back of our scene is pointing this way, and we've got left and right. And it's just little things like that that I know I'm starting from the same point every single time. Now to actually save this, what we're going to do, and we're just going to bring this in a tiny bit. There we go. Go to defaults and save startup file. And now if I were to start a second instance of Blender, you'll see it's actually going to start me with this startup file, which is really nice. Again, it remembers everything in your scene. So one of the things you might want to do is set the menu over here just to be your dimensions and your frames and that kind of thing. So now if we save the startup file, where are we? Go to defaults, save startup file, and I had to click it twice. I was a little bit quick there. There we go. If we now open up Blender, before you can do anything, you can set your dimensions, you can set your render length, you can set your frame rate, and it looks like I set it to 50 by accident here. So let's actually turn that off. Let's set this to 30. And it just goes to show the amount of stuff that you could customize to make your life easier. And now when we start it up, we've got everything I want. There we go. It's set up perfectly the way I want. And now I can set my render settings and quickly start moving on. And all of the stuff that I want to be enabled is enabled, and I don't have to worry about it anymore. So that's sort of the reason for this. And throughout the course, this is kind of the UI you're going to be looking at. So with that said, let's move on to some preferences I change as well, just to make my life a little bit easier. That have to do sort of with the nature of my work, but also a couple of things that just make your life a little bit easier as well, hopefully. So let's move on to that. So now that we've set up our default startup scene, let's have a look at a couple of preferences we can tweak just to make our life a little bit easier. Now, in general, what I like to do is, for example, if we hit render, and there's no camera in here, so let's actually add a camera real quick. There we go. There's nothing in the scene, it's fine. But if we hit render now, we're going to get a separate window. And I don't really like that. I prefer to have everything render inside of Blender's windows. So what you could do is you could set the temporary windows here, and you could say render in full screen. And now what's going to happen is if we hit F12, it's actually going to render inside that same Blender window without opening an extra window. Now, this is very personal. You don't have to worry about it too much if you don't like it. But it's good to know that it's in there if you want to change it. So if you'll see my UI doing that while I'm rendering during the course, you'll know why that is. Other than that, there's only a couple of things that I changed. So for example, this interactive navigation stuff, and actually let's go to interface. I like to turn off these navigation controls because I'm just using shortcuts, and these are more meant for people that are beginners or don't really have the shortcuts down yet. So I like to turn those off together with, in viewport, I just want to see a simple axis, and that's it. I don't want to have too much going on. Now, one of the more important ones, and this is especially especially relevant when we're using a lot of modifiers, and we're going to have a lot of crazy geometry in our scene, to keep the, and actually let's set this to be always on top. There we go. So now we can move around in our viewport. To keep the viewport somewhat performant, generally I'll actually turn off anti-aliasing. And if we look at some of these edges here, and it probably won't be super visible on the recording, if we set this back up to 8 samples, it's going to sort of give these a little bit of refinement. And I don't necessarily want that because it might slow things down if I have a lot of geometry. And the workflows that we're going to be discussing mainly revolve around doing a lot of cool tricks with geometry that can be a little bit heavy sometimes. So to set that up, it's kind of important to make sure that everything stays a little bit smooth. So I tend to turn that off. Same with the textures. I'm going to limit the size because I'm using a laptop. So I want to limit the size to maybe 4K. If I bring in a huge texture, that's not going to fill up my laptop's VRAM and go completely nuts. It's just a good one to tweak and to keep in mind. Now let's move on to some of the other stuff. Editing, animation. Yeah, there's a few things like now allowing negative frames. So if you want to play something back that starts at negative frames, and you've got your timeline here set up to where it's maybe at -100 or whatever, if you turn on allow negative frames, it will actually play back. If you turn it off, then it might wig out and only start playing from frame 1. So if you're used to other applications as well, this is a good one to turn on. Then in general, I changed the default interpolation type of new keyframes to linear, so they don't actually have any curves or anything on them. I prefer this because I do a lot of looping, and that way I know any animation I do is just going to be in a linear fashion. And I'll actually show you this real quick. So if we grab Suzanne here, and we'll put in location. Let's switch over to our curve editor. We'll put in location, then, actually, let's move to the end of the scene. There we go. And I'm just going to hit home. And that's fine. And now you can see these are linear. If I were to change this, so let's delete all of these keyframes. If I were to change this back to Bezier, let's move this up, go to the first frame, and just insert a location keyframe. Really just to demonstrate the difference here. And put in new location keyframes. Now you'll see this has a curve on it. So if you prefer this, obviously you don't have to change it. But in my case, I prefer having linear frames. And if I ever need any sort of interpolation, I'm gonna put it in myself. I'm just showing you this in case things are a little bit different in your scenes when you're following along with this. Add-ons, we'll get back to these in the video after this. There's a few add-ons that I'm going to enable by default that ship with Blender that are actually quite nice. Input, I don't really change a lot. Navigation, there's some stuff here as well which I prefer. I'm just going to run through it for the sake of it. So by default, if I zoom in and out, you can see my mouse is in different corners. It's actually always going to zoom to the middle of the scene. Now, I prefer having it zooming to my mouse position. So you see, as I turn this on, it's actually going to zoom to where my mouse is. Again, these are things that you might prefer. You might have also seen me move this. So you can see if we switch between the different views, this is basically controlled by the smooth view. If we set this to 0, it's just going to be instant. So if we go back to this window, you can see I like things to be really fast and snappy, and you know, like I said, take away a lot of the extra stuff that I might not need. Again, if you've got a really heavy scene where rotation might be a little bit slow, not that it happens that much, but it could be a case of turning that off as well. Similar to when I'm orbiting, I want to orbit around my selection. So let's say I'm going to grab another monkey and I'm going to move that back on the y-axis. Now you can see my rotation actually doesn't rotate around the monkey I've got selected. If I turn this on, we'll actually rotate around the selected object. I prefer this. Again, it's up to you what you prefer and what you want to do. And auto depth as well is going to sort of slow down your zooming in or rotation depending on where your mouse is. So if I'm rotating on here, it's going to rotate slightly different than whether I'm on a different monkey here as well. So again, these are just little things that you can tweak, but I thought I'd mention them anyway. Then key map, I'm assuming most of you are going to be using the default key map. Mine's slightly different. I use pan for the middle mouse rather than orbit. So yeah, it's down to you what you prefer. But again, you can mess with these at your own leisure. Then we're not using cycles render devices, so we could set this up. But you know, I've got an RTX 2070 in this laptop here. I could also use optics because this is an RTX card if we're using cycles. But as we're mainly focusing on Eevee, I'm not going to bother with this too much. What is important though is the number of undo steps. So if we set these up really high, and I'm just gonna move stuff around, duplicate it, grab it, duplicate it. Select these, duplicate it, grab it, grab it, grab it. Maybe go into edit mode, change some stuff. And there's a really great function in Blender that actually shows you all of your steps that you've done. And I like to set these undo steps up to the maximum, which is 256. So hopefully I've done more than 32 steps now. There we go. And if we go to undo history, let me just move the preferences here. You can actually see all these steps, and I'm going to move my preferences here. And you can actually go back to all the different steps. So the more you have set up here, the better. Now, I do set up a memory limit, especially on a device like a laptop. Generally, I'll set this to about a quarter or half my RAM. So I've got 16 gigs in this case. So I'm going to set the undo limit to 8 gigs. Just to make sure that we're not going completely crazy and it's not trying to cache everything in memory all the time. Blender can be quite memory hungry if you don't limit it a little bit. So that's good to know. And other than that, we're down to save and load stuff. So autosave is set to 2 minutes by default, which is fine. And here you could say where all your temporary files, like the autosaves and things, are saved if you really wanted to customize this. That's a very quick overview of some of the preferences I change. I might turn off autosave preferences as well, so I have control over when I save my preferences, so I can actually click the button. This is mainly useful for when I'm using cycles, but in our case, it's not that relevant. But it's in there if you want it. So yeah, very quick overview of preferences, and with that, let's move on to the add-ons section. So to top off the very quick introduction stuff, here you can see is my startup file. I've got a little extra section here, and this is where all the keyboard shortcuts and things will show up as we're working on the rest of the course. But I want to do one final one where I talk about some add-ons that I'd like to enable that can be handy, that I just like. And instead of typing add-on, what I meant to type was extra. So these two are actually extra objects that you have. So by default, if we look in here, we have a whole bunch of stuff in mesh and curve, but there's a whole bunch of useful ones here in extra objects. So if we turn these both on and just go into our settings, you can see now we've got things like single vert or round cube, different sort of toruses, math functions, diamonds, that kind of thing, and other extras. And same with the curves. Now we've got a lot more shapes. Now, they're not necessarily that relevant for this course, but especially when you're doing motion design, being able to have, access to a lot of these shapes very quickly is really, really nice. So this is one I would really recommend. The second one is called Loop Tools, and I turned this on as well. And in one of the tutorials, or one of the sections rather, this is going to become relevant. And just to show you what it does and where to access it, when in edit mode, if you right click, now you've got an extra menu called Loop Tools with a few extra tools in here, and it's mainly the space tool in particular that we're going to end up using in one of the following videos. And that's why you want to enable it by default as well. Let's go back to our preferences. And then the final one, and this is probably one of the most, most important ones, is called a node wrangler, which is used for shading. And really all that does is, let's say, grab a new material over here and set this to just material view. If I'm bringing in any texture, let's just grab whatever, a wave texture, it doesn't really matter. Hitting Control Shift and clicking on that texture will give us a real-time preview of this. And I'm going to use this a lot in the shading section. So if you want to be able to follow along, you want to make sure to enable that add-on as well. And in the options, or rather in the Node Wrangler tab here, we get a lot more options. And some of these I'll talk about in one of the future videos as well. So with that said, these are sort of the 3 setup videos. And now at least you know why I've set things up a certain way and why my Blender looks a little bit different. And yeah, now it's time to really get into it. So let's move on to the next videos and really start with the course and have a lot of fun. So I hope you enjoy what's coming. I've put a lot of time into it, and I think it's going to be a pretty cool course overall. So yeah, let's do it.